The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but General Marcus Harlan didn't notice. He stood in the officers' lounge at Creech Air Force Base, surrounded by marble floors that reflected the Nevada morning light, telling the story again. The one about the drone operator who'd frozen during a critical strike authorization. His audience, 3 captains and a major, laughed at all the right moments. Harlan had a gift for timing, for turning operational failures into cocktail anecdotes. He gestured with his mug, nearly spilling the contents, when the door opened and she walked in. The woman wore navy coveralls with a Patch Company logo stitched crookedly across the breast pocket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, streaked with premature gray at the temples. She pushed a cleaning cart, the left wheel squeaking with each rotation. Harlan barely glanced at her. The janitor was part of the furniture, invisible in the way that service workers often become to those who have never learned to see them. She moved methodically toward the corner where someone had spilled sugar near the coffee station, her movements efficient and unremarkable. "So anyway," Harlan continued, "the kid actually requested a psych eval afterward. Can you imagine? One missed shot and he wants to talk about his feelings." More laughter. The woman knelt beside the spill, her back to them, and began wiping the floor in small, precise circles. Captain Morrison, fresh from the Pentagon, leaned against the leather couch. "Sir, with respect, the new pilots are different. They've grown up with participation trophies. Real combat decisions." He trailed off, noticing Harlan's attention had shifted. The general was staring at something on the wall near the janitor. An old photograph, half hidden behind a filing cabinet that had been moved during renovations. The image showed an A-10 Thunderbolt II banking hard over Kandahar province, its distinctive twin engines and straight wings caught in perfect profile against a dust-orange sky. Below it, a small placard bore names and dates from 2012. Harlan's face had gone pale. The woman stood slowly, her cleaning forgotten. When she turned, there was something in her eyes, not defiance exactly, but a quiet knowledge that filled the suddenly silent room. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something small, letting it rest in her palm where the light could catch it. The metal gleamed. "General," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of steadiness that comes only from having made impossible choices and lived with them. "I believe you were talking about combat decisions." The room held its breath. Outside, an F-16 screamed across the tarmac, but inside there was only the sound of that squeaking cartwheel and the weight of something unspoken. 13 years earlier, the call sign, Reaper 6, meant something different. Lieutenant Nadia Volkov had earned it during her 3rd deployment, not for the aircraft she flew, but for the precision of her strikes. The A-10 Warthog wasn't glamorous. Pilots called it the flying gun, because the entire aircraft was essentially built around its 30 GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. It was slow, ugly, and absolutely perfect for close air support. Nadia loved it the way some people love scarred dogs from shelters. She'd grown up in a Baltimore row house where her mother cleaned offices at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Her father had disappeared before her 3rd birthday, leaving behind only a Navy Cross he'd earned in Desert Storm and a photograph of himself standing beside an F-14 Tomcat. Nadia had studied that photo until the edges went soft, memorizing the angle of his smile, the confidence in his stance. She joined ROTC at 17, lying about her mother's signature on the permission slip. By 23, she had her wings. The 354th Fighter Squadron deployed to Bagram Airfield in March 2012. Afghanistan's spring meant dust storms that could ground aircraft for days and Taliban forces regrouping after winter's pause. Nadia flew missions along the Pakistan border, providing overwatch for ground units pushing through mountain passes where insurgents held tactical advantage. The A-10 could loiter for hours, circling at 15,000 feet, waiting for coordinates that meant someone below needed her cannon or her Maverick missiles or just her presence, a reminder that they weren't alone. Her wingman was Captain Eric Rossdale, call sign Dice. a Texas native who chewed tobacco in the cockpit despite regulations and had 3 confirmed equipment kills before Nadia arrived. He treated her with the careful courtesy men reserve for women they don't quite trust in combat roles. Not hostile, just watchful, waiting for her to prove herself or fail. He didn't seem to care which. Reaper 6, you're cleared hot on building complex grid November Victor 4732. The JTAC, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, radioed during her 8th mission. His voice was steady, professional, but Nadia heard the strain underneath. Ground forces were taking fire. She could see the compound below, tan walls against darker earth, muzzle flashes visible even from altitude. She rolled into her attack run, the warthog responding like it was an extension of her intention. The cannon roar lasted 3 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the compound's western wall had ceased to exist. Good hits, the JTAC confirmed. Troops moving to secure. That night, Dice bought her a beer at the base cantina. It was the closest thing to respect she'd received. The night everything changed began with mechanical failure and ended with a choice no pilot should have to make. Nadia was on her 47th mission, leading a 2-ship formation with Dice as her wingman. They were supporting a Marine platoon pushing toward a suspected Taliban weapons cache in the Kunar Valley, where mountains rose like broken teeth and the river below ran silver in the moonlight. The mission brief had been routine: destroy the cache, provide cover for the Marines' extraction. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The ambush began as the Marines entered the compound. Small arms fire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, disciplined and coordinated. Nadia listened to the radio traffic escalate, heard the platoon commander's voice tighten as casualties mounted. She dropped to 8,000 feet, seeking targets, when her aircraft shuddered violently. Reaper 6, you're trailing smoke, Dice reported, his voice sharp. Looks like engine 2. Nadia checked her instruments. Oil pressure dropping, exhaust temperature climbing. The A-10 was designed to take punishment. The cockpit was surrounded by titanium armor, the engines separated to prevent cascade failures. But this was different. Warning lights illuminated her panel like a malicious Christmas display. She nursed the throttle, felt the aircraft's response lag. Below, the Marines were pinned, taking fire from a reinforced position intelligence hadn't known existed. Dice, take lead, she transmitted. I'm running damage assessment. -6, you need to RTB, return to base. The safe call, the smart call. Nadia watched the infrared display. 14 Marines clustered behind inadequate cover while muzzle flashes bloomed from elevated positions. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush site perfectly: natural stone fortifications, clear fields of fire, one entrance easily covered. The platoon's extraction point was 200 meters north, might as well have been 200 miles. Without air support, they wouldn't make it. Her left engine was dying. She could feel it in the way the aircraft pulled right, the way power delivery stuttered. Getting back to Bagram would require both engines or extraordinary luck. She calculated distances, fuel remaining, weapons payload. The math was cruel but clear. Reaper 6, say status. The JTAC now, his professional calm cracking. She could hear automatic weapons fire through his microphone. Reaper 6 is mission capable, Nadia lied. Then she rolled into her attack run while her engine temperature gauge climbed toward the red. The gun run was textbook perfect despite the crippled engine. Nadia compensated for the aircraft's pull, adjusted her angle to maximize the GAU-8's effective cone of fire. The cannon's roar was a physical thing, a violence that resonated through the airframe and into her bones. 2 seconds. 3. Tracer rounds drew a line of light from her aircraft to the Taliban position, each 30 projectile capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Against stone fortifications and human bodies, they were absolute. Direct hit, direct hit. The JTAC's voice carried desperate relief. Enemy position neutralized, we are mobile. Nadia pulled up hard, felt the G-forces compress her into the seat. Her left engine died completely as she climbed. The aircraft's nose wanted to drop, the asymmetric thrust trying to roll her into a fatal spin. She fought the controls, years of training and instinct overriding the fear that wanted to flood her bloodstream. The A-10 could fly on one engine, barely, slowly, with no margin for error, but it could fly. "6, your engine's on fire," Dice reported, and there was something in his voice Nadia had never heard before. Fear for her, not judgment. "Punch out, Nadia, punch out now." She checked her altitude, 12,000 feet. Below, the Marine platoon was moving toward their extraction point, covering each other in practiced leapfrog patterns. She watched them on her display, 14 icons representing 14 lives who would make it home because she'd made her gun run, because she'd chosen them over herself. But she wasn't done yet. "Negative on ejection," she transmitted. "I'm flying this bird home." The next 40 minutes existed in a space between life and death where focus became everything. Nadia nursed the single engine, watched her fuel gauge drop toward empty, flew with a delicacy that would have seemed impossible in the Warthog's brutal frame. She talked to the aircraft in her mind, promising it rewards if it just held together a few minutes longer. The fire in her left engine had gone out. Lack of fuel, lack of oxygen, or divine intervention, she didn't care which. Dice stayed with her the entire flight, calling out altitude and heading corrections, maintaining formation like she was his mission now. She brought the A-10 down at Bagram trailing smoke and flying on fumes and willpower. The landing was harder than it should have been, one engine approach offering no room for finesse. The aircraft bounced once, settled, and Nadia stood on the brakes while the runway lights blurred past. When she finally rolled to a stop, fire crews were already surrounding her, but she sat in the cockpit for a long moment before unbuckling. Her hands were shaking now that it was over. The maintenance chief who inspected her aircraft found 37 bullet holes. One round had severed a hydraulic line, another had punctured her reserve fuel tank. The left engine was completely destroyed, and there was shrapnel embedded in the titanium tub that protected her cockpit. According to his report, she should have ejected or died trying to fly home. There was no third option in his experience. Dice found her in the debriefing room an hour later. She was still in her flight suit, staring at a cup of coffee someone had given her. He sat down across from her without invitation, his own flight suit sweat-stained and reeking of tobacco. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "You saved 14 Marines tonight," he finally said. "That JTAC told me 3 of them were 19 years old, fresh out of infantry school." Nadia didn't respond. She was thinking about the moment she'd made her choice, the clarity of it. No hesitation, no drama, just simple math written in blood and fuel consumption. She would do it again. She would always do it again. This knowledge sat in her chest like a weight, like a promise. "I was wrong about you," Dice continued. "All of us were. You're not just a pilot, Nadia. You're something different." She looked up at him then, saw genuine respect in his eyes, and felt nothing. The respect didn't matter. The opinions didn't matter. Only the mission mattered, only bringing everyone home. She'd learned something about herself in those 40 minutes of single-engine flight, something that both frightened and clarified her. She was willing to die for people she'd never met, and that willingness made her dangerous in ways the military would never fully understand or appreciate. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived 3 months later, presented in a formal ceremony she barely remembered. But medals don't pay bills or change institutional bias. After her third deployment, Nadia faced a choice she'd never anticipated. The squadron commander called her into his office on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of meeting that starts with closed doors and ends with life alterations. There had been complaints, he explained, his tone apologetic but firm. Some of the senior pilots felt her risk tolerance was problematic, that her decisions in the field demonstrated poor judgment rather than heroism. The specifics were vague, the logic circular, but the message was clear. Her career advancement had hit a wall made of resentment and fear. She was 29 years old, a decorated combat pilot, and suddenly facing the realization that the Air Force saw her as a liability rather than an asset. The next promotion board would pass her over. The one after that would recommend reassignment to a desk job or training command. She could stay in and slowly suffocate, watch younger male pilots with fewer missions and less experience move past her, or she could leave on her own terms. Nadia thought about her mother, still cleaning hospital offices at 63. Thought about the row house in Baltimore with its leaking roof and ancient furnace. She'd been sending money home since her first deployment, but it was never enough. Officer pay was decent, but not enough to retire her mother, not enough to escape the generational poverty that had defined her childhood. She needed something more, needed to translate her skills into financial security. The defense contractors were hearing. Private military companies paid twice what the Air Force did for pilots willing to work overseas, training foreign air forces, or conducting surveillance operations in conflict zones. Nadia interviewed with 3 companies before accepting an offer from Sentinel Defense Solutions. The contract was for 18 months in the United Arab Emirates, training Emirati pilots on ground attack tactics. The money was extraordinary, enough to buy her mother a small house outright, enough to build a real savings account. She submitted her resignation papers 3 weeks later. Her squadron gave her a brief ceremony and a plaque. Dice hugged her, which surprised them both, and told her to stay safe. She promised she would, knowing it was a lie they both needed to hear. The Emirates contract lasted 11 months before budget cuts ended it prematurely. Nadia returned to the United States with a decent bank account but no clear direction. She applied to commercial airlines, was told repeatedly that her military experience didn't translate to civilian cockpits. A-10 pilots were too specialized, too focused on weapons delivery rather than passenger comfort. She was 32 years old, unemployed, and discovering that combat decorations meant nothing to human resources departments. She found work where she could, flight instructing at a small airport in Arizona, freelance aviation consulting, a brief stint as a test pilot for a startup developing autonomous cargo drones. None of it stuck. The startup folded, the consulting work dried up, and the flight school couldn't afford to keep her after their insurance rates increased. Nadia moved between short-term rentals, watched her savings evaporate, and felt the creeping desperation of someone whose skill set had become obsolete. Then she met Daniel Kovac at a veterans networking event she'd only attended for the free food. He was a former Army logistics officer, warm and stable and utterly normal in ways that felt like relief after years of chaos. They dated for 4 months before he proposed. Nadia said yes not because she loved him, though she thought she might, eventually, but because she was tired of fighting alone and he represented security. They married quietly in a Las Vegas chapel. Her mother attended, wearing the nicest dress Nadia had ever seen her in, and cried throughout the ceremony. Nadia felt like she was watching someone else's life, standing in a white dress she'd bought at a department store clearance rack, promising forever to a man she barely knew. But Daniel was kind, and kindness felt like enough. Their daughter Ava arrived 10 months later, a squalling bundle of red-faced determination. Nadia held her in the hospital room, counted her fingers and toes, and felt something crack open in her chest. Terror and love in equal measure. This tiny person depended on her completely, and Nadia had no idea how to keep anyone safe outside of a cockpit. She tried to be a good mother, tried to find satisfaction in domesticity, but she felt herself disappearing into diapers and formula and sleep deprivation. Daniel left when Ava was 2 years old. He didn't leave with cruelty or drama, just with the quiet resignation of someone who'd realized he'd married a ghost. Nadia had never fully come home from the war, he explained during their last conversation. Part of her was still circling over Afghanistan, still calculating weapon solutions and fuel consumption, still choosing strangers' lives over her own safety. He couldn't compete with those memories, couldn't pull her back to earth. He would pay child support, he promised. He would be a good father from a distance. Then he moved to Oregon for a job opportunity and started dating a kindergarten teacher who'd never heard a cannon roar. Nadia didn't fight the divorce or his departure. She was too tired, and some part of her understood he was right. She had never fully transitioned from combat pilot to civilian, had never learned to care about the small domestic crises that constituted normal life. Ava's tantrums terrified her less than enemy fire had. Grocery shopping felt absurd after flying damaged aircraft home on instinct and prayer. The child support checks arrived irregularly. Daniel meant well but was forgetful, and Nadia's lawyer had drafted an agreement with no real enforcement mechanism. She picked up work as a night janitor at Creech Air Force Base, the only place that would hire her with hours flexible enough for single motherhood. The job paid minimum wage and came with no benefits, but it allowed her to work while Ava slept, meant she could be present during the day when her daughter needed her. She cleaned offices where officers planned drone strikes, emptied trash cans filled with classified documents that had been properly shredded, mopped floors in briefing rooms where pilots younger than her discussed missions over countries she'd once flown above. The work was invisible and exhausting, but it kept her close to aircraft, let her walk the same halls where military decisions were made. Some nights she would stop in the lounge, stare at old photographs on the walls, remember when she'd been the one making those decisions. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 23, wings fresh and future unlimited. But it was her life, and she had Ava, and that had to be enough. The morning General Harlan told his story. Nadia had already worked a full shift. She'd arrived at Creech at 11 p.m. the previous night, cleaned 6 offices, 3 bathrooms, and 2 conference rooms, all while her mother watched Ava in the small apartment they shared near Nelly's Boulevard. She was exhausted down to her bones, operating on coffee and muscle memory, thinking about nothing except getting through the shift so she could go home, wake Ava up, make breakfast, pretend to be a functional adult. She'd been wiping down the coffee station in the officer's lounge when Harlan started talking. His voice carried that particular confidence of men who'd never been seriously challenged, who'd risen through ranks based as much on politics as performance. Nadia recognized his type. She'd served under several like him, men who were competent enough to avoid major disasters but lacking the imagination to inspire genuine excellence. She hadn't meant to listen to his story. But then he mentioned the drone operator, the frozen moment of decision, and something in his tone, the mockery, the casual dismissal of a pilot's struggle, made her pause. She continued cleaning, invisible in her coveralls, while Harlan described the incident like it was comedy rather than tragedy. A young pilot had hesitated during a strike authorization. Target was confirmed hostile, coordinates verified, weapons system armed. But the pilot had seen children playing 2 buildings over and had asked for reconfirmation. The request had delayed the strike by 90 seconds. The target escaped. Harlan was laughing about those 90 seconds, about the pilot's humanity, his inability to divorce tactical necessity from moral weight. The officers around him laughed too, and Nadia felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. This was how the military digested trauma, turned it into anecdotes, stripped away the human cost, made jokes about the moments that haunted good people. She stood and turned before she consciously decided to. Her hand found her pocket, closed around the small metal object she'd carried every day for 11 years. The metal sat in her palm, catching the overhead fluorescent light. It wasn't the distinguished flying cross. That one lived in a box in her closet, along with her flight logs and photographs from deployments she couldn't quite bear to look at anymore. This was her Air Force Achievement Medal, a lesser decoration given for her work training Emirati pilots. She'd chosen it specifically because it represented the end of her military career, the point where she'd transitioned from combat pilot to corporate contractor to nothing. But Harlan didn't know that. He saw only the medal, the uniform insignia still visible beneath her coverall's open collar, and the sudden terrible understanding that he'd been mocking combat decisions in front of someone who'd actually made them. "General," Nadia repeated, keeping her voice level, "I believe you were talking about combat decisions, about a pilot who hesitated when children were involved." The room had gone completely silent. Captain Morrison straightened from his casual lean against the couch. The other officers watched with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. Harlan's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, recognition, anger, something that might have been embarrassment. "I don't believe we've met," he said finally, his tone attempting authority but landing somewhere near defensive. "You work here." "I clean here," Nadia corrected. "Nights, usually, but I picked up this shift because someone called in sick." She paused, let the medal rest visible in her palm. "Before that, I flew A-10s out of Bagram, 47 combat missions, 3 decorations for valor." Morrison made a small sound, quickly suppressed. He was staring at Nadia with new eyes, recalculating everything about her in light of this information. The other officers looked similarly shocked, their worldviews adjusting to accommodate the reality that the janitor they'd ignored was a combat veteran with more flight hours than most of them. Harland recovered his composure with visible effort. "I see, and you felt compelled to interrupt a private conversation because you were mocking a pilot for having a conscience," Nadia said simply. "And because I once made a decision that cost me everything. I'd like to tell you about it." Nadia had their attention now, though she wasn't sure she wanted it. The story she was about to tell wasn't one she'd shared with anyone except the military investigators, the board of inquiry, and the therapist she'd seen twice before deciding therapy was too expensive. But something about Harlan's casual cruelty, his dismissal of a young pilot's moral struggle, demanded response. These officers needed to understand that combat decisions didn't happen in clean briefing rooms or theoretical scenarios. They happened in smoke and blood and impossible mathematics. 2012, she began. Kunar Province. I was providing close air support for a Marine platoon that got ambushed. My aircraft took damage, lost my left engine. Standard protocol would have been to RTB immediately, let my wingman handle support. But the Marines were pinned, taking casualties, and extraction was still 200 meters out. They needed my gun run or they weren't going to make it. She could see them doing the math, understanding the choice. Fly home safely or risk everything for troops she'd never met. Harlan's expression had shifted from defensive to wary, like he was beginning to sense where this story led. "I made the run," Nadia continued. "Neutralized the enemy position, gave the Marines their window. Then I flew 73 miles on one engine, brought my aircraft down at Bagram with no fuel reserves and 37 bullet holes. Maintenance said I should have ejected. My commanding officer agreed. But 14 Marines went home to their families because I didn't." Morrison spoke up quietly. "That's extraordinary. You must have received." "The Distinguished Flying Cross," Nadia confirmed. "Presented 3 months later in a ceremony I barely remember. What I remember more clearly is the meeting 4 months after that, where my squadron commander explained that some senior pilots felt my risk tolerance was problematic, that my decisions demonstrated poor judgment. They suggested I was unstable, overly emotional, unable to make rational tactical assessments." She watched understanding dawn on several faces. Harlan's remained carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight. He knew this story now, knew where it ended. "I was 29 years old and already being counseled out," Nadia said. "So I resigned, took a private contract, came home, tried to build a normal life." The true cost of her decision hadn't become clear until years later. Nadia had sacrificed her military career to save 14 Marines, but the institutional retaliation had been subtler than she'd initially understood. Her resignation had been accepted quickly, too quickly, with none of the usual retention efforts the Air Force made for decorated pilots. Her personnel file had been coded in ways that made commercial airline jobs nearly impossible. References from superior officers were lukewarm at best, and some simply declined to provide them. She'd been blackballed without official acknowledgement, punished for being simultaneously too brave and too female. The system couldn't openly reprimand her for saving lives, so instead it had ensured her heroism became her liability. Every employer who might have valued her combat experience was subtly warned off. Every opportunity was quietly closed. She'd been erased from the community she'd nearly died protecting. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," Nadia continued, her voice still level despite the emotional weight of the memories. "I tell you because that pilot you were mocking, the one who hesitated when children were involved, that pilot was demonstrating exactly the kind of moral courage the military should value, the kind that distinguishes us from our enemies." Harlan finally spoke, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "With respect, that's a naive perspective. Hesitation gets people killed. Combat requires decisiveness." "Combat requires judgment," Nadia corrected. "Any pilot can pull a trigger. The truly skilled ones know when not to. That drone operator probably saved civilian lives with those 90 seconds of hesitation. You should be using them as an example of proper target verification, not as a punchline." The silence that followed felt different than before, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with reassessment. Morrison looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The other officers studied their coffee cups, their shoes, anything except Nadia's steady gaze. She disrupted their comfortable narrative, forced them to confront truths about institutional bias and combat reality that were easier to ignore. Harlan set his coffee mug down carefully on the marble-topped table. When he looked at Nadia again, something had shifted in his expression. The shift in the room's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. These officers, who moments ago had been laughing at a pilot's moment of conscience, now grappled with the reality standing before them in coveralls. Nadia represented everything they'd been trained to respect: combat experience, tactical excellence, decorations for valor, packaged in a form they'd learned to dismiss. The cognitive dissonance was written across their faces. Captain Morrison found his voice first. "Ma'am, your service record should have made you a natural fit for commercial aviation. What happened?" "Politics happened," Nadia said bluntly. "The same politics that makes female pilots work twice as hard for half the recognition. The same politics that turns heroism into liability when it comes from someone who doesn't fit the expected profile." She paused, weighing how much honesty to offer. "I made choices that saved lives but threatened egos. The institution chose to protect itself rather than support me." It was the most direct she'd been about her experience, and speaking the truth aloud felt both liberating and exhausting. For years, she'd internalized the narrative that her career failure was somehow her fault, that she'd been too aggressive, too emotional, too unwilling to play the games necessary for advancement. But standing in this lounge, facing these officers who represented the system that had failed her, she felt the burden of that false narrative lift slightly. Harlan's expression had become unreadable. He was a general officer, a man who'd spent decades navigating military politics, and Nadia's story likely confirmed things he'd suspected but never acknowledged. The Air Force, like all military branches, had problems with gender integration that went deeper than official policy could address. Women who excelled were often punished for their excellence, particularly when their competence highlighted male mediocrity. "I owe you an apology," Harlan said finally, and his sincerity surprised Nadia. "Not just for the conversation you overheard, but for representing a system that failed you. Your service record should have led to continued opportunities, not to this." He gestured at her cleaning cart, the squeaking wheel, the visible markers of how far she'd fallen from her former life. Nadia felt something complex move through her chest, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The apology hung in the air, and Nadia realized she had a choice to make. She could accept it gracefully, retreat back into invisibility, continue cleaning offices while decorated pilots planned missions in rooms she'd never enter again. Or she could push further, use this moment to advocate for change beyond her personal situation. She thought about that young drone operator, the one Harlan had mocked, who was probably struggling with the moral weight of their hesitation. "General, your apology means something," Nadia said carefully. "But what would mean more is action. That drone operator who hesitated. They need mentorship, not mockery. They need superior officers who understand that ethical combat decisions are complex, that hesitation in the face of potential civilian casualties demonstrates exactly the kind of judgment we want in people controlling lethal force." Morrison nodded slowly, seeming to consider this perspective for the first time. "You're suggesting we reframe the incident." "I'm suggesting you recognize it for what it actually was," Nadia replied. "A moment of appropriate caution in an environment where caution is often punished. If we can't acknowledge the moral complexity of modern warfare, if we can't support pilots who struggle with the human cost of their decisions, then we're creating a system that values compliance over conscience." She watched her words land, saw them ripple through the group's collective understanding. These weren't bad officers. They were products of a system that prioritized certain values over others, that rewarded decisiveness even when decisiveness meant ignoring ethical concerns. Changing that system required people willing to challenge its assumptions, to speak uncomfortable truths to power. Harlan picked up his coffee mug, looked into its cold contents and set it back down. "You're right," he said, and this admission seemed to cost him something. "I've spent 30 years in uniform, and I've told that kind of story too many times. Made jokes about situations that deserve serious reflection. It's easier to laugh than to examine our own failures of leadership." Nadia felt an unexpected flicker of respect for the general. Admitting fault required courage, particularly for someone of his rank, and his willingness to do so publicly suggested depth she hadn't initially recognized. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. The officers asked questions about her deployment experiences, her tactical decisions during that final mission, her perspective on close air support doctrine. Nadia answered honestly, sharing insights she'd accumulated over 47 combat missions. She talked about the evolution of ground attack tactics, the psychological toll of providing fire support for troops in contact, the ways that aircraft limitations shaped pilot decision-making. Morrison took notes on his phone, interrupting occasionally with clarifications or follow-up questions. The other officers contributed their own experiences, creating a dialogue that felt remarkably honest for a group of military personnel spanning different ranks and backgrounds. Nadia found herself relaxing slightly, remembering what it felt like to be valued for her expertise rather than dismissed for her gender or economic circumstances. Harlan proved particularly interested in her assessment of current close air support capabilities. He explained that he was overseeing a review of CAS doctrine, trying to integrate lessons learned from recent operations while preparing for potential near-peer conflicts where air superiority couldn't be assumed. Nadia's perspective, grounded in actual combat experience rather than theoretical analysis, offered insights the review board hadn't considered. "The A-10 was perfect for Afghanistan," Nadia explained. "Low-intensity conflict, permissive air environment, long loiter times supporting troops who needed persistent presence more than precision strikes. But against sophisticated air defenses, it's vulnerable. The question isn't whether to retire the platform, it's what capability we're replacing. Because those Marines I supported didn't need stealth or speed. They needed a pilot willing to stay overhead until the situation was resolved." She felt herself slipping back into the professional identity she'd thought was lost forever. In this moment, she wasn't a janitor interrupted officer's conversation. She was a combat veteran offering operational insights to people who needed them. The distinction mattered more than she'd realized. Morrison looked up from his notes. "Ma'am, would you be willing to speak with the pilot who hesitated? I think your perspective might help them process what happened." Nadia considered the request. Meeting with a struggling pilot meant emotional labor she wasn't sure she could afford, meant potentially reopening wounds that hadn't fully healed. But she said yes anyway, because she remembered what it felt like to be a young pilot questioning their judgment, unsure whether their moral concerns indicated conscience or weakness. If she could help someone else navigate that confusion, maybe her own struggles would mean something beyond personal suffering. She agreed to meet with the pilot the following week, once Morrison could arrange it through proper channels. Harlan stood, signaling the conversation's end. "I'd like to discuss something else with you," he said to Nadia. "Would you be willing to stay a few extra minutes?" The other officers filed out, offering respectful nods and verbal thanks for her insights. Morrison shook her hand formally, his grip firm and sincere. "It's an honor, ma'am, truly." When they were alone, Harlan gestured for Nadia to sit. She remained standing, years of enlisted service making the power dynamic uncomfortable despite his apparent goodwill. He noticed her hesitation and sat first, deliberately choosing a lower position, trying to neutralize the rank differential. Nadia appreciated the attempt even as she recognized its limitations. "I want to offer you a job," Harlan said without preamble. "Nothing glamorous, and it would require some bureaucratic creativity, but I think there's a role here for someone with your background and perspective." Nadia felt her pulse quicken despite her attempts at maintaining composure. Hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed as many times as she had, but she couldn't quite suppress it. "What kind of role?" "Tactical advisor for the CAS Doctrine Review Board," Harlan explained. "Contract position initially, with possibility of permanent civilian employment if it works out. The pay would be substantially better than janitorial work, and the hours would accommodate childcare needs. More importantly, you'd be contributing to policy decisions that affect combat pilots and ground forces." The offer was simultaneously everything Nadia wanted and everything she was afraid to want. It represented validation, financial stability, meaningful work that utilized her actual skills. It also represented re-engagement with the military system that had failed her, exposure to institutional dynamics she'd barely survived the first time. She thought about Ava, about the stability a real salary would provide, about her mother who was too old to still be cleaning hospital offices. "Why," she asked, "why offer this now?" Harlan's answer was more honest than she expected. He explained that the Doctrine Review Board had been struggling with integrating combat veteran perspectives into their analysis. Too many of the advisors were career staff officers who'd never flown combat missions, whose understanding of close air support was theoretical rather than experiential. The board needed voices like Nadia's, pilots who'd made life-or-death decisions under pressure, who understood the human cost of tactical choices. "But specifically, why me?" Nadia pressed. "You didn't know I existed until 20 minutes ago." "Because you challenged me," Harlan said simply. "Because you had every reason to stay silent, to remain invisible, and instead you chose to speak truth to power. That takes a particular kind of courage, and it's exactly what the review board needs. Too many advisors tell me what they think I want to hear. You're willing to tell me what I need to hear." The logic was sound, but Nadia remained cautious. She'd learned through hard experience that promises from senior officers could evaporate when circumstances changed or political considerations intervened. She needed guarantees, needed to protect herself and Ava from another round of institutional betrayal. "I want any offer in writing," she said. "Contract terms, salary, job description, all of it documented. And I want a clause that prevents termination without cause. I've been burned before, General. I won't let it happen again." Harlan nodded, seeming to expect this response. "Reasonable. I'll have my staff draft a contract by end of business Monday. You can review it with a lawyer before signing." He paused, then added quietly, "I can't undo what happened to you before, Nadia. The system failed you in ways I'm only beginning to understand. But I can offer you an opportunity to ensure it doesn't fail others the same way. Your insights could literally save lives." It was the literally that convinced her, not hyperbole but simple truth. Combat doctrine shaped how pilots engaged targets, how ground forces called for support, how missions were planned and executed. If Nadia could influence those decisions, could ensure they reflected actual combat experience rather than abstract theory, she would be protecting future Marines like the ones she'd saved in 2012. She would be validating her own sacrifices by preventing others from having to make the same impossible choices. Nadia left Creech Air Force Base that morning as the sun climbed toward noon, her cleaning cart abandoned in the maintenance closet, her coveralls exchanged for the civilian clothes she'd worn to work. She drove toward the small apartment she shared with her mother and Ava, processing everything that had happened. The city looked different somehow. The same strip malls and casinos and residential streets, but transformed by possibility. For the first time in years, she felt like the future might contain something beyond survival. Ava was watching cartoons when Nadia arrived, sprawled across the worn couch with the particular grace of 5-year-olds who haven't yet learned self-consciousness. Her mother looked up from folding laundry, took one look at Nadia's face, and smiled. Something happened. Nadia sank onto the couch next to her daughter, who immediately climbed into her lap without looking away from the television. She wrapped her arms around Ava's small body, felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, and let herself imagine what life might look like with financial stability and meaningful work. She could afford a better apartment, could reduce her mother's hours, could give Ava opportunities that didn't involve poverty and scraping by. I might have a new job, Nadia said carefully, not wanting to promise something that might evaporate. Better pay, better hours, working as an advisor on military policy. Her mother set down the laundry basket, sat beside them and took Nadia's free hand. You deserve this. You've always deserved better than what you got. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching incomprehensible children's programming while Nadia's mind raced ahead, planning and hopping and trying not to hope too much. She thought about the young drone operator she'd agreed to mentor, about the tactical insights she could offer the review board, about the possibility of making her military experience mean something beyond personal trauma. That night after Ava was asleep, Nadia retrieved the box from her closet. She opened it slowly, confronting artifacts from a life she'd thought was finished. Her flight logs, creased and coffee-stained. Photographs of her squadron, young pilots grinning in front of their aircraft. The distinguished flying cross in its presentation case. She touched each item gently, remembering who she'd been when flying defined her identity. Maybe she could be that person again. Different, certainly, scarred by experience and motherhood and poverty, but fundamentally the same. The contract arrived Tuesday morning via encrypted email. Nadia read through it carefully, paying attention to termination clauses and benefit structures, and all the small details that could transform a good opportunity into another trap. The terms were generous: $60,000 annually to start, full benefits, flexible scheduling that would allow her to maintain childcare responsibilities. The contract was for 1 year initially, with performance reviews every quarter and the possibility of permanent civilian employment after 12 months. She hired a lawyer with money she couldn't really afford, but the investment proved worthwhile. The attorney reviewed the contract, suggested minor modifications to strengthen her protections, and negotiated directly with Harlan's staff. Within a week, they produced a revised document that satisfied her concerns. Nadia signed it in the lawyer's office, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. Her first day as a tactical advisor felt surreal. She arrived at Creech wearing professional clothes she'd bought at a discount retailer, carrying a briefcase she'd borrowed from her mother, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The security guard at the gate recognized her. She'd cleaned the guardhouse enough times, and his double-take when she showed her new credentials was almost comical. The Doctrine Review Board met in a conference room she'd mopped dozens of times. Nadia walked in as a participant rather than invisible service worker, took a seat at the table, and introduced herself to people who'd never noticed her before. Some recognized her from her appearance in the officers' lounge. Others were meeting her for the first time. Morrison was there, serving as the board's primary liaison to operational units, and his welcoming smile helped ease her nervousness. The meeting itself was technical and dense, full of acronyms and doctrinal references that required her to stay intensely focused. They were reviewing engagement protocols for close air support in urban environments, trying to balance military effectiveness with civilian casualty mitigation. The discussion was thoughtful and professional, but Nadia noticed a gap between theoretical consideration and operational reality. When appropriate, she offered her perspective, not dominating the conversation, but contributing insights grounded in actual combat experience. She described what it felt like to receive target coordinates while watching civilians move through the engagement area. Her contributions during that first meeting were measured and careful, but they shifted the conversation in subtle ways. When one analyst suggested that pilots could simply wait for civilians to clear an area before engaging, Nadia explained the tactical impossibility. Targets moved, coordinates expired, ground forces couldn't wait indefinitely while under fire. When another proposed stricter engagement rules that would have required multiple verification steps, she walked them through the timeline of her mission in Kunar province, demonstrating how additional delays would have resulted in Marine casualties. She wasn't arguing against civilian protection or ethical engagement, quite the opposite. She was providing reality checks that ensured their proposals were actually implementable in combat conditions, rather than theoretical exercises that would fail under pressure. The board members listened with increasing attention, taking notes, asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. After the meeting, Morrison caught up with her in the hallway. "That was excellent. You have a gift for translating operational experience into policy recommendations. Several board members specifically mentioned how valuable your input was." Nadia felt a flush of professional pride she hadn't experienced in years. This was what she'd been trained for, not flying combat missions necessarily, but using her experience to improve how the military operated, to protect both service members and civilians through better decision-making frameworks. The work was intellectually challenging and emotionally meaningful, and she was good at it. Over the following weeks, she settled into her new role. She reviewed engagement protocols, analyzed after-action reports from recent operations, participated in discussions about equipment requirements and training standards. She met with the drone operator who'd hesitated, a 26-year-old captain named Marcus Chen, who was wrestling with whether he'd made the right call. Nadia spent 2 hours with him, sharing her own experiences with moral injury, explaining that conscience wasn't weakness but essential humanity. "The hard part isn't pulling the trigger," she told him. "Any pilot can do that. The hard part is maintaining your humanity while doing violence, recognizing the weight of your decisions without being paralyzed by them. You showed exactly the right judgment, Captain. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Chen's relief was visible, and Nadia understood she was doing more than advisory work. 3 months into her contract, Harland called her into his office. Nadia went with some trepidation, old patterns of expecting punishment still deeply ingrained. But the general was smiling when she entered, and he gestured to a chair with apparent satisfaction. "The review board is extremely impressed with your contributions," he said without preamble. "Your insights have fundamentally shaped our recommendations, and several senior officers have specifically requested your continued involvement. I'd like to offer you a permanent position." The offer included a salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and the title of Senior Tactical Advisor. It was more than Nadia had allowed herself to hope for, and she felt tears threatening despite her attempts at professional composure. This represented complete rehabilitation, from janitor to respected expert, from dismissed veteran to valued contributor. It validated every sacrifice she'd made, every impossible choice. "There's something else," Harland continued. "Your work here has attracted attention from the Air Force Personnel Center. They're reviewing your separation file, examining the circumstances of your resignation. It appears there were irregularities in how your case was handled, recommendations that should have been included but weren't, performance evaluations that were suspiciously lukewarm given your decoration record. They're considering whether you were constructively forced out in violation of military regulations." Nadia's breath caught. She'd assumed her military career was permanently over, that the door closed by institutional bias could never be reopened. "What does that mean?" "It means you might have grounds for reinstatement," Harlan said carefully. "Or at minimum, a formal apology and correction of your service record. The process would take months and there's no guarantee of outcome, but Personnel Center seems genuinely interested in making this right." Nadia sat with this information, trying to process its implications. Reinstatement would mean returning to active duty, regaining everything she'd lost: rank, flight status, career trajectory. It would also mean surrendering the civilian position she'd just achieved, re-entering the military system that had failed her once already. The choice wasn't simple, and she needed time to consider which future she actually wanted. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Take all the time you need," Harland assured her. "This offer isn't going anywhere." That evening, Nadia sat in her new apartment, larger and cleaner than anything she'd lived in since leaving the military, and tried to make sense of competing possibilities. Ava was at her grandmother's house for the night, giving Nadia rare solitude to think. She spread her old flight logs across the kitchen table, ran her fingers over entries documenting missions she'd flown years ago. Each notation represented decisions she'd made, lives she'd affected, moments when her skill had mattered. She missed flying with an ache that had never fully subsided, missed the perfect solitude of altitude, the clarity of mission parameters, the absolute focus required for combat operations. Her current work was meaningful, but it was cerebral rather than visceral, theoretical rather than immediate. She contributed to improving doctrine, but she wasn't actually executing missions. Reinstatement would return her to the cockpit. She could fly again, could rebuild the career that institutional bias had destroyed. The Air Force's willingness to investigate her separation suggested genuine institutional change, or at least recognition that her treatment had been unjust. Maybe things were different now. Maybe she could succeed where she'd failed before. But reinstatement also meant risk. Military service required sacrifice, deployments, relocations, long periods away from Ava. Her daughter was 6 now, at an age where stability mattered enormously. Nadia's civilian position offered predictability and presence, allowed her to be a consistent parent in ways that military service never could. She'd already sacrificed one version of her life for her country. Did she owe them another? She thought about the young drone operator, Captain Chen, who'd hesitated when children were involved. Thought about future pilots who would make impossible choices, who would need mentors who understood combat's moral complexity. She could serve those pilots better as a civilian advisor